All right, before this video gets started, two things. One, this is a video about white supremacists, the militia movement, and police brutality. So if those things are not what you're in the mood for today for your YouTube watching experience, maybe give this one a pass or come back to it later. They got a watch later button for a reason. Second, this also is being filmed in the wake of the extremely tragic mass shooting in Uvalde, Texas. And yeah, I think this video is for those police officers who are supposed to protect and serve, who waited outside the building while elementary school teachers literally sacrificed their lives for their children. Let's get going. This is a bit of a new format. I'm working on another video, but it is big. And so I'm going to prep this one more like a podcast and talk to you a little bit heart to heart about something that I have noticed that you might be interested in. Turns out that there are thousands of police officers and soldiers, people who are trained to use armed lethal force against people on behalf of the United States government, are involved with the militia movement or other explicitly white supremacist movements. These movements are explicitly an effort to undermine and dismantle the government that these people are hired to protect. If you don't know what the militia movement is, I have been making an entire series about it, so you should probably check that out. But just know that it is a group of far-right militants who have very deep connections to the white supremacist far right. Anyways, let's dive into the story here. So I guess the first thing I want to do is introduce you to a man by the name of Richard Whitehead. He is your typical far-right extremist in the United States. He's praised extremist groups. He has called for the public execution of government officials who are not loyal to Donald Trump. He wrote a post in 2020 urging law enforcement to ignore the law when it comes to enforcing COVID-19 restrictions, saying that they came from tyrannical governors and that America was on the brink of a civil war. This is very similar to the militia movement, the far-right extremists calling for or hoping for a second American Civil War. Groups today that are part of this include groups like the Boogaloo movement and the Oath Keepers. In fact, this guy was a member of the Oath Keepers in 2016 and 2017. He even paid his dues. And in 2020, he ran for sheriff in Kootenai County, Idaho. Now, there are thousands of Richard Whiteheads in the world who espouse these sort of very dangerous and very concerning beliefs, and probably you should be on some sort of FBI watch list. But there's something a little bit scarier about him, which is that his job is to train police officers. Technically, he's a consultant who trains police officers on safety and personal combat. According to his own testimony, he has trained as many as 560 American police officers, over 85 sessions in 12 states in the last 4 years. This consulting company has run into hot water in the past. It got in trouble with the Washington State Training Commission at one point because it referred to people who wear turbans as towel heads, and also posted pictures of women in bikinis as part of their advertising program. Oh my God. But what's worse than the advertisement is the courses itself. Whitehead claims to have a deception detection technique. How useful for police officers. It does seem to have this weird pernicious aspect in which he encourages police officers to not believe sexual assault survivors if they refer to themselves and the assailant using the word we. I'm not kidding. Other students taking the course have complained about blatant misogyny, racial slurs, and one quote that I found about trans people that I am not going to repeat for this video. So of course, knowing this information, it must be obvious that this is a guy who no longer teaches, right? He's been banned from the institution for life. Well, no, he's actually still teaching several courses coming up this year. So what do you think Whitehead's response to all this was? That's right. The people who found out about all of this, by the way, this was all discovered through a commission into the January 6th insurrection. He claimed that the commission was putting too much reading into a single student testimony and that he's essentially being canceled by the woke mob. And speaking of response, the Reuters story that got my attention to this, their post on Twitter, some replies. And Whitehead's not alone. According to the commission's report, there are about 5 police instructors who have trained across the country who might have been directly or indirectly involved with the January 6th insurrection attempt. Let's talk about another example, a guy by the name of Ryan Morris. He's the founder of an organization called Tripwire Operations Group. According to Morris's own words, in 2021, they hosted 50 training events and about half of them were for law enforcement. Another thing that's interesting is that Mr. Morris and some other employees of Tripwire happened to be in Washington, D.C. on January 6, 2021. This is after Tripwire made public social media posts, essentially aping the big lie, the whole Donald Trump conspiracy theory that his election was stolen. So he and his employees were not just in the city, they were at the Stop the Steal rally. Apparently, they were employed at this event, and when asked what they were there to do or who hired them to be there, they refused to answer. All they mention is that they sometimes are hired to protect high-level executives or to assist law enforcement. And their work pales in comparison to a guy by the name of Tim Kennedy. Let's talk about him. In 2021 alone, he held about 200 police officer training sessions, which means that this is the guy who was giving instructions to police officers about how to conduct their business. He also happens to be part of the Boogaloo Boys. He's written about his desire to quote-unquote Boogaloo, which is a cool internet slang nickname for wanting to start a second civil war, usually a race war. 2 months after making that post on social media, he then also posed with a Hawaiian shirt, which is sort of a symbol for this movement because white supremacists are extremely lame. And while taking a picture of himself on social media wearing this Hawaiian shirt, put the caption, "If you choose to be an asshole, I picked out a special shirt for the occasion." Yeesh. But maybe this is all just a coincidence. Maybe he's just a Jimmy Buffett fan or something. Except that he also has a lot of pictures and a lot of associations with a guy by the name of Joseph Biggs. Joseph Biggs being a person who is currently in jail facing charges associated with the January 6th insurrection. Now, who is he? Well, he's a former U.S. Army soldier who also used to be a correspondent on Alex Jones, the fascistic conspiracy theory radio show. And Tim Kennedy and this guy were pretty close. There's pictures of them going on bike rides together and talking about putting Biggs as the Interior Secretary in his imaginary administration. And when Biggs wrote that he was going to go to a Antifa rally to basically go and beat up people at that rally, Kennedy apparently posted replying, "Oh, that sounds like fun. Sounds like a date." So then what's the deal with these guys? How is it that there's this group of people who are in positions where they are training police officers on safety and techniques, and yet they are actively part of a far-right movement that is explicitly trying to overthrow the government? How is that not a thing that we are concerned about? And it's actually part of a trend. And this is sort of a thing that I mentioned in my series on the militia movement, which isn't done, but this is kind of going to fit into it a little bit. But not only were police trainers at January 6th, and in Whitehead's case specifically, they have found connections to the Oath Keepers, the 3%ers, and the Proud Boys, which, let me know if maybe I should do profiles on these three groups, but these are sort of the faces of the modern day militia movement. A white supremacist, misogynistic, hyper right-wing group that is actively trying to start a race-based civil war in America. And this infiltration of the far right into the police is not just limited to trainers. There's a lot of evidence that shows that there's deep infiltration of police and other armed authority figures by militia members, but also literal neo-Nazis and Klansmen. So let's look a little bit at January 6th specifically, about an example of how this kind of infiltration can go down. The response team to protect Congress is a group called CERT. It stands for Containment Emergency Response Team. Their job is essentially to evacuate Congress in case of an insurrection like, say, the January 6th insurrection, but they did not show up, or if they did show up, they showed up very late. Looking into it, you can actually find out that CERT was trained by a group called Northern Lion LLC, the CEO of which is a guy by the name of John David Patinsky, who to this day still has neo-Nazi symbology on his uniforms. and even on their website. And despite multiple warnings to the Capitol Police to stop hiring this person to train your police officers, it was basically ignored. And if you're to go to Northern Lion's website today, you'll see that they even say that they only offer training to members of the police and military. And according to their own website, they continue to do training for the military and for police, even hosting a close quarters combat workshop for members of the military and police as recently as this March. Now, this is step back, and I am a historian, so I would be negligent in my duties if I didn't talk a little bit about how this far-right infiltration into police circles is not new, and if anything, white supremacy is baked into the very notion of policing. I mean, I could go as far as to say that white supremacy is essentially the founding principle of the United States, but I feel like that's a different conversation and far too spicy for an already very spicy video. In the early 20th centuries, groups like the Texas Rangers would go to border towns in Texas and essentially go on lynching campaigns against Mexicans under these really specious accusations of them being bandits. Or, most famously, the Jim Crow South had a police force that was deeply entwined with the Ku Klux Klan and violently looked over the lynching of tons of Black Americans. And when the Civil Rights Movement came, they were the front line of white supremacy fighting against those who are trying to make a more racially just world. I mean, shit, in the Jim Crow South, sometimes lynchings were announced ahead of time and the names of the victims were put in the newspaper, and police would be at the event. And it all sort of goes back to the origin of policing in general. Now, I've already talked about this in a previous video, and there's also a podcast series called Behind the Police that covers it much better. But the police essentially started under two major currents in American history. In the North, it started as the anti-labor movement. It was people who were hired to essentially beat up those who were trying to unionize or push for better working conditions. But in the South, it was an evolution of slave patrols, people who were hired to go and find slaves that had run away from their plantations. And so the police have not really been about justice so much as they've been about maintaining order and enforcing the hierarchy. The North's not exempt from these sort of like racial laws either, because a lot of northern states had what were called black laws that were essentially a set of explicitly racial laws about what Black people were and weren't allowed to do. Also, things like the fugitive slave law, when put into act, would force authorities in the North to turn over any slaves who had escaped from the South, even if it was in a state where slavery was illegal. After slavery was abolished, the white supremacist subjugation of Black people continued through things called black laws, as well as the Jim Crow laws. So, that's like the big picture. But, you could find that in any history textbook. What's the big deal? What's actually interesting, and what actually kind of fits into the sort of thing I'm trying to tell you about today, which is that there is deep white supremacist, explicit white supremacist infiltration into police departments. Like, as I mentioned, a lot of police had deep ties with groups like the Ku Klux Klan, especially in the South. Or you have in cases like in Blandford, Indiana, where in 1923, the local sheriff, in collaboration with the Ku Klux Klan, worked together to illegally essentially evict all the Black people from town. And even outside of the South, there were many states that had what were called sundown laws, which were laws in several cities that allowed for vigilante mobs and police to essentially prevent any Black people from existing in them after dark. But if the law could not be used to enforce white supremacy, or it was considered insufficient, a lot of white supremacist groups moved to terrorism. And this terrorist violence was assisted by the police, either implicitly by the police not investigating these crimes or allowing them to happen under their watch, or explicitly with police officers being literally involved in these violent terrorist attacks. Now, keep in mind that police institutions have continued to this day. And in the 1920s, there were like 1 million Klan members, and they pushed themselves and infiltrated into higher levels of police management. I know that people are going to twist that to say that all police officers work explicitly with the Ku Klux Klan. That's not true. But the institutional memory that was set up by these people being in positions of leadership and being able to set policy is important to mention. And it's also not just the 1920s. And going to the military for a second, there's a lot of white supremacist infiltration into that organization as well. For example, in 1995, 3 Fort Bragg paratroopers were arrested for killing a black family. When the army went to investigate white supremacists within Fort Bragg's infrastructure, which Fort Bragg is notorious for having white supremacist organization on base, they found 19 paratroopers that were participating explicitly in hate group activities. They all got discharged, but none of them faced any criminal charges or anything. And then one went on to do the Oak Creek Massacre in 2012, which was a mass shooting where a group of Sikh worshippers in a Gurdwara in Oak Creek, Wisconsin, were shot by a guy by the name of Wade Page. And sort of outside of the halls of institutional, deadly power, right-wing extremist groups who had been nascent since sort of the crackdown after Oklahoma City saw a huge increase in membership after the election of Barack Obama. And after the election of Donald Trump, it just freaking hockey pucked. And in the wake of the Black Lives Matter movement, where police were put under increasing scrutiny for their racial bias, the defensive police who thought that, their racism was justified, or that, racial profiling is good, or just feeling under attack because they didn't see a problem with their racism. And the, far right extremists who were against Black Lives Matter and were defending police had their interests aligned, and those two meshed really hardcore with each other. And now, if you've ever seen the blue line American flag, there is a high, far right police enmeshed movement going on in the US. A lot of far-right groups intentionally targeted law enforcement organizations in order to expand their ranks, thinking that they could use their deadly force to, undermine the institutions of the US government. Some are exclusive for police officers. Like, for example, there's the Constitutional Sheriffs and Peace Officers of America, which was founded by a guy by the name of Richard Mack, that has been linked to a lot of far-right activism and telling their members to not enforce laws that they disagree with, mostly to do with COVID restrictions and gun control. And The Atlantic did a study of the Oath Keepers, which is another far-right militia group that had a database of their members leaked in the investigation of the January 6 riots. And in the investigation of this membership, they found that about 10% of the Oath Keepers were members of the police or the military, and many more are retired members of the police or military. This totals to about 30,000 former or current police and military who are associated with a right-wing terrorist organization that is trying to start a race-based civil war. And another group, the 3%ers, apparently can boast some similar numbers, but we don't have the leaked database to show the explicit numbers. And this is not a new phenomenon. I keep saying I talked about the sort of past and the sort of more recent stuff, but this is something that has been warned about by internal investigations for decades. I'm going to talk a little bit about Michael German, who is an FBI agent or a former FBI agent who investigated the extent of white supremacist infiltration into law enforcement organizations and found that it was a massive problem, and said that, the government should be doing something about this in a report that came out in 2006. Since 2000, he has been studying this even more closely and has found that tons and tons of police officers since 2000 have shown cases of posting explicitly bigoted racial stuff on their social media profiles. But also there are many cases like in 2014 where 2 Florida police officers were found to actually be active Ku Klux Klan members, which was the second time in 5 years that police department had found KKK members in their ranks. Another example, in 2018 in California, the Sacramento police were found to be working with neo-Nazi groups in order to build cases and press charges against anti-racist activists, some of which had been stabbed. And there's tons of other cases, like in Orange County, a deputy sheriff, as well as another Chicago police officer, were found with militia logos on their clothing. One police officer in Olympia, Washington, had photos found of him posing with militia groups, and a video surfaced of police officers standing by while a racist mob attacked activists right in front of them. I mean, crap, this isn't even just infiltration. In LA County, their sheriff's department had a neo-Nazi gang operating inside that actively harassed Black and Latino members of the community. And that's just the police. This also shows up in the military. Like, for example, 12 National Guard members had been fired for being associated with right-wing militias on the day before Joe Biden's inauguration. And the most famous example that comes from my most recent video, Timothy McVeigh was a former soldier who then went on to commit the Oklahoma City bombing. Now, this is all like, a bunch of different examples and cases, but the problem is that there's not a lot of effort in the US government to investigate the extent of this infiltration. So it's just this one guy, Michael German, who has been trying to piece together everything over the years. And what he's finding is pretty extensive. And it's all gotten worse in the police's war on the Black Lives Matter movement. The police in California, Oregon, Washington, and Illinois are all facing investigations for associations with far-right militias in helping each other to oppose Black Lives Matter protests. To this date, no state, local, or federal police organizations do any sort of vetting of their members to make sure that they're not associated with these kinds of groups. Instead, they tend to rely on groups like the Southern Poverty Law Center, a nonprofit, to do this work for them. A group that, tries their best, but they are just a nonprofit. And they're limited in the scope of what they can do, obviously. And at Black Lives Matter protests, this lack of vetting has played out. We have seen multiple cases of police doing basically nothing while white supremacists and militias will show up to just attack and do violence on Black Lives Matter protests. You see in cases like in Kenosha, Wisconsin, where the police told these armed right-wing militias that they appreciate them being here and that they welcome their help. And there was a case where an armed gunman was just walking by the police and people were shouting like, "That guy just shot somebody, please arrest them." And police just didn't do anything. And it's created a situation where protesting is maybe more dangerous today than it has been in a long time because the police have essentially set the precedent that right-wing militias can show up, do tremendous violence against Black Lives Matter activists, and then just leave without any sort of police intervention at all. And then at the same time, the police will act with extreme prejudice and overwhelming violence against the Black Lives Matter protesters. And reports from far-right militia groups has had them interpret this as them pretty much believing that they have the support of the police and that they can keep doing these actions. And because of this neglect, there have been 500 incidences of armed right-wing militias showing up to assault Black Lives Matter activists. This has resulted in 64 cases of assault, 38 cases of vehicular assault, and at least 9 cases of shots being fired at demonstrators and 3 people getting killed. In Gilbert, Arizona, there was this Back the Blue protest that was counter-protested by Black Lives Matter, and the protesters essentially assaulted them with the police just watching on. And I think that this is like the important part that I want to get to is that like, if we are going to talk about police conduct and sort of the role of the police and racial bias within policing, we tend to talk of it as if it's like something that's a minor factor, or if it is a factor, it's more of a thing of implicit bias and systemic oppression, but not really. In a lot of cases, it's not just, trying to figure out implicit biases. It's explicit racist aggression by actual white supremacists. Now, we're a few years out from the big Black Lives Matter protests of 2020, but at the end of the day, the full result was that not many police departments actually saw any of their funding get caught. So, like, defund the police was more of a protest slogan, and it never really translated into any actual policy. Despite that, it did create a impression, which led to a media narrative that the police are under attack and that, police are being defunded across the country. And because Democrats are spineless weasels, it has led to many of them calling for an increase in police funding, including very recently, several Democrats backing a bill that would increase funding for police that is, going going on right now. And even in the State of the Union, the president himself said that they need to fund the police and that funding needs to be increased. And this is all bad for multitudes of reasons. It shows that there's a deep, deep sickness of white supremacism in the United States, that it's not this implicit background thing that, racism and white supremacy has always been part of the United States, and it has always been part of law enforcement from inception to this very moment. And while that continues to be a threat because of the media narrative that, you don't want to appear weak on crime or, against the police, has not been met by any concrete action. Which allows right-wing militias to either think that the police are on their side or to literally join them and or to recruit from among their body. And as more militia members and Klansmen and neo-Nazis and these kinds of people join the ranks of the police, it increases their overall legitimacy. They are part of the institution, part of institutional power, and without it being challenged, means that it is getting tacit consent from the government. Especially it takes these people who dream of one day starting a war to essentially kill people of color or to return them back to a subservient status in America, and gives them access to weapons and military and combat training. And in doing so will give them the skills and tools they need to let their Turner Diary dreams come true. Furthermore, it associates these groups that are, actively seditious, that actively want to take down the US government, and associates them with like patriotism and the symbology of America, because really under neoliberalism, the military and the police are the only organizations that get any money at all. So it really shows that these are the people the state emphasizes. And when the face of patriotism are people linked to the Klan, to groups like the Oath Keepers, the Three Percenters, the Boogaloo Boys, the Proud Boys, that is terrifying. That is very terrifying. Now, learning this, how do you look at a police officer that you see on the street and not think of just how far has, far-right militias, how far have they infiltrated my local police? And the answer to that is, I don't know, but it's something they're trying. Well, this is going to be a super awkward transition, but this video is almost definitely demonetized, and the only thing kind of keeping this afloat is the amazing people on Patreon. So thank you, my patrons, and let me know if this format is too loose for you. If you like it, I can make more. Anyways, take care, and I'll see you guys next time.